I'm now delighted to introduce Ilsa Godlowitch from WIK, the well-known Economic Institute for Communication in Bonn, who will present the report that she prepared for BEREC on sustainability. Floor is yours, Ilsa.
Good afternoon. I'm just waiting now for the slides to appear, and then I can begin. Here we go. So this is a study that we were asked to prepare by BEREC on the environmental impact of electronic communications. I'll start with some facts and figures. We reviewed a range of literature and found from this overarching review that the ICT sector is responsible for around 2 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Within that, the part that is primarily in the remit of telecoms regulators, the bit that's highlighted in this slide in grey, accounts for less than 1/4 of the emissions from the ICT sector as a whole. You can see if we look into that box a little bit more deeply, a lot of the impact, the majority of the impact, appears to come from the operation of networks as opposed to the deployment of those networks. And there is an equal contribution from fixed and mobile networks, with potentially a growing contribution from the mobile side. If we want to look at the other areas, data centers, we estimate from literature, account for around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And their estimates on the impact of terminal equipment range from 60 to 80%. A lot of the effects there come from larger equipment such as TVs and computers. Important point here, where is this heading? Because this is the picture today. We also reviewed literature about where emissions from the sector are going. And this very much depends on what is known as the strength of the rebound effect. So to what extent will improvements in energy efficiency outweigh the trend towards increased consumption of data? And we see different estimates here, ranging from a somewhat stable consumption of electricity and greenhouse gas emissions within the sector to a situation where the ICT sector could account for as much as 14 to 24% of global emissions by 2030, 2040. We didn't look very closely in this study about the knock-on effects in other sectors, such as transport, buildings, and so on, but we have prepared other studies which look into that in more detail. We then looked within electronic communications at the different stages of the life cycle, and here is a graphic from our study. We can divide it roughly between the deployment phase, where we're talking about the manufacture of cables, the manufacture of equipment, and so on, the upgrading, construction, to the operation phase, where we're talking about using power to operate networks, the maintenance of those networks, and so on. As I mentioned before, industry estimates suggest that the greatest environmental impacts are linked to network operation, about 90%. And within that, the largest portion probably stems from the access network. There are also some impacts from the deployment phase, and I should highlight here, these don't only relate to greenhouse gas emissions, but also other environmental impacts, including the consumption of raw materials, the effects on land and water, and so on. During the decommissioning phase, again, most impacts relate to resources, soil pollution, waste management, and so on and so forth. As part of the study, we interviewed a number of telecoms operators, as well as equipment manufacturers, to understand what strategies they had put in place to limit their impact on the environment. What I should point out is that several operators that we interviewed, in fact, quite a few of them, had set targets to achieve net zero emissions, and the target range came between 2030 and 2050. There were also a number who'd made commitments to use renewable energy, improve energy efficiency, reduce waste, or limit toxic substances. I have to say that actions taken by electronic communications operators to limit their environmental footprint are very much consistent, dovetail with their economic interests. In a sense, a lot of these activities serve to reduce costs by reducing energy consumption, particularly important in this day and age with the rising cost of energy, and also reduced duplication in digging. You can see from this diagram, but I leave you to read it at your leisure in the report, the different actions that telecoms operators reported taking in the different phases: deployment, operation, and decommissioning. Now, here is a somewhat interesting point. I think it was the most interesting aspect of the study, and that is what might be the potential trade-offs between achieving greater or limiting environmental impact and potentially some of the other objectives that regulators need to achieve in the context of the Electronic Communications Code, for example. And it struck us that if regulators seek to reflect environmental concerns, this might create some tensions or trade-offs with existing regulatory objectives. And I've listed a few of them here. One is, what about the trade-off between energy efficiency and technological neutrality? We know that fiber to the home is more energy efficient, in particular per gigabit, than other legacy technologies, including cable and FTTC VDSL. The framework requires regulators to be technologically neutral. So how does that fit with the concept that if you want to be truly energy efficient, it would be better to promote more advanced technologies such as FTTH? Then there are other potential trade-offs between objectives such as infrastructure competition and network sharing. We know that it is more energy efficient. It also is more efficient in the use of resources to share physical infrastructure, even share active infrastructure in some cases. But what about the potential effects there on dynamic competition, on innovation, and so on? Again, are there trade-offs there? Strategies to reduce energy consumption might also affect quality. Is it necessary to have objectives to achieve complete coverage of certain mobile technologies when they know that they won't be used in certain parts of the country? There perhaps could be trade-offs between one and the other. And also another very interesting point, what about content? Is there a trade-off between having ever higher digital resolution or a trade-off between, I guess, the use of Bitcoin or other digital services which might consume a lot of energy, and environmental objectives and what is perhaps truly required or needed by consumers? And also, what about the trade-offs between the environment and cost? So more environmentally efficient technologies like fiber might cost more than alternative technologies that you could deploy, for example, in very rural areas. Or what about upfront costs to deploy base stations which are self-powering? That will be perhaps more costly, at least in the initial phase, than using an alternative approach. What are the ways in which those trade-offs could be made? And it struck us that if and when regulators take environmental considerations into account, they might need to do this through using a cost-benefit analysis approach. Now, here is the final part of our study. We were asked, what role could NRAs potentially play in this field if it's of interest for them? First of all, some open questions. What should be the role of the NRA versus the environmental agency? What should be the role of horizontal measures, measures covering all sectors, in limiting the emissions and other environmental impacts from telecoms versus measures targeted at specific sectors? There were, however, a number of areas of agreement. One is that we need global action, which covers the whole life cycle. Another was that we need consistent data. This is very important. It was rather difficult to compare some of the data that we received. And in general, that collaboration with the environmental agency is important. On the right-hand side, we summarized some possible avenues that NRAs could look at if they wish to be more closely involved in promoting sustainability. They could, for example, engage in data gathering and benchmarking exercises. They could build awareness amongst consumers or indeed telecoms operators. They could promote the deployment of efficient new technologies, support the switch-off of legacy technologies. They could promote the use of existing infrastructure, ducts, poles, and so on. They could also look at potential incentives or even conditions in the context of certain tools such as spectrum awards, state aid, and I know that this has been discussed in the context of the review of the state aid guidelines, and indeed conditions for rights of way. They could also get involved potentially in other elements beyond electronic communications networks, such as in customer premise equipment, which is responsible for a large proportion of emissions in the sector. But there are important constraints on NRAs. What about the remit, the budget? And as I mentioned before, what about how this fits in with existing objectives under the telecoms legislation under which NRAs apply the rules? The code, and notably the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. Our last comment was that even if NRAs don't get involved in sustainability efforts in the context of telecoms regulation, there are other initiatives through which they could engage. That includes the UN sustainability goals, the European Green Deal, and indeed national sustainability plans. But I would encourage you to read our study, which is available on the BEREC website for more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilsa. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ilsa. While you prepare your first question to Ilsa, BEREC is asking me to remind you to respond to the public consultation on sustainability, which is open until the middle of April. So don't forget, don't forget. Who wishes to ask the first question? Please, please. Gentleman at the front here. Can you bring a mic? Could you please stand up? Otherwise, the camera cannot catch you, I'm told. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Really interesting subject and presentation. It's Matthew Howitt from Assembly Research. I just wondered, as part of what you were looking at in terms of the NRA's role, do you foresee any kind of role in sort of monitoring the compliance with the various targets and commitments that operators have made, particularly if they become a sort of point of differentiation when selling to consumers? Who's sort of keeping check of whether or not they're hitting the targets that they're making? Is there a role for the NRA in that exercise?
That is a very interesting question indeed, and the answer is I think it's up to individual NRAs, or perhaps even more importantly, member states to consider who should be involved in monitoring these commitments and how.
Thank you. Another question for Ilse. While you think of one, Ilse, under one scenario, I know that you need a crystal ball to look at in the future, but under one scenario, I was quite staggered by the possible electricity consumption of the ICT sector. 14 to 24%, you said. Now that despite of the sector adopting new technologies like 5G, do you think that sooner or later we will have to promote digital sobriety? Am I saying it correctly? In other words, convince consumers that they need to consume less data by perhaps limiting the quality of the video they watch? Or, I mean, is it a path to go down? In our sector, because we are telecom professionals, it's all about more efficient network. But is there also something to be done on the consumer side in terms of consuming less? I'm asking the question.
That's another very interesting question to which I don't have a concrete answer. I think that could probably be another area for debate. I mean, what is the extra value of very high resolution video on a small screen, for example? Are there services out there like cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin that are consuming perhaps a higher proportion of data than is warranted from an economic or environmental perspective? I can't answer those questions. I think it's something that needs to be considered rather carefully. It was interesting, though, that there was some limitation on screen, on resolutions during the COVID period for other reasons. I'm wondering if consumers noticed the difference.
Yes. Anne-Marie, okay, Anne-Marie is confirming that that's no question. Then just a comment from me. Among a great presentation, Ilsa, I particularly enjoyed your slide with the trade-off, trade-off between sustainability and, well, you didn't say net neutrality, but you could have. When you talked about quality of service, it smells like stream on. Oh, sorry, did I say competition, coverage, and so on. Yeah, they really an excellent point. Ilsa, our time is already up. I wished we could have. This is, I'm sure, a topic to which BEREC will return often. I guess in the future, I'm speculating, but I think I'm probably right. And thank you again, Ilsa. And
thank you.